Okay, before we can actually start tracing and drafting, we need to make a note of how many pieces of pattern we are going to end up with. This is to help you keep track of which pieces you've done, which pieces are still left that need to be drafted. So let's see how many pieces there are in this. The binding for the neck is going to be one piece. The sleeves are going to be a second piece. This front of the t-shirt is 2 layers. Each of them is going to be a different piece. So that's going to be piece 3 and piece 4. And then the back is going to be my 5th piece. So when I'm done drafting this pattern, I should have 5 pattern pieces. I'm going to start with the back of the t-shirt because it is, from what I'm looking at, the easiest one to draft. And it's going to help me by serving as a template for some of the other aspects of the t-shirt that I'm drafting. So you're going to fold your t-shirt in half lengthwise. Go this way. And you want to get it as flat and symmetrical and evenly folded in half as possible, which is kind of hard. This material has 4-way stretch. It stretches both vertically and horizontally. That's really comfortable material, really nice stretch, but sometimes it makes it hard to get things nice and flat and folded. So this is pretty good. Okay. Make sure, there we go. Make sure that it is nice and straight in the top and the bottom. All right. There's a little bit of that front poking through. Okay, so this is the back, and you're going to use your straight edge and create a long vertical line. This is going to serve as your anchor. And I need it to be pretty long, so I need to extend it a little bit more. Anytime you're drafting a pattern for a ready-to-wear garment that can be done on the fold, you need this anchor line. Now what you're going to do is you are going to slide this t-shirt up close to that fold as you can get without going over. There. And you're going to use your pattern weights to hold it down so it doesn't move around into different areas, which will complicate your tracing. Okay. Now when you draft a pattern, you can decide whether you want to include your seam allowance when you're drafting, or when you have finished drafting, you can add that seam allowance back in. I like to include it when I draft because I don't always remember to go back and add the seam allowance, but it's up to you. And this is super scientific. I eyeball a lot of what I'm doing. So for the hem, I know I'm going to have a 1/2 inch hem, so I need to add a 1/2 inch to the end down here. The sides, if you have an overlock or a serger, you know that seam is going to be only a 1/4 inch, so you can add a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you don't have a serger, you can add however much of a seam allowance that you typically use when you construct clothing. In my case, it's going to be a 1/4 inch because I do have a serger to use. So you use the end of the shirt as a guideline and you trace the garment. Now I get to the end, and here I do want to kind of flatten it so that I'm not cutting myself too short. I'm going to go out just a little bit more because I'm only adding a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to trace up to the armpit. know I'm getting really close here, but this seam is actually there and not all the way out here, and so I'm kind of eyeballing it at this point. Okay, let's tuck you in. There. Okay. So I get up to my armpit, and this is where, being right-handed, I'm going to go to the other side of the table, do the rest. So instead of worrying about the armhole for now, I'm coming up here to the shoulder. I'm going to lay my hand down here, and I'm going to add that 1/4 inch in, and I'm just going to go from the edge here where the seam, where the neckband meets the shirt, and I'm going to go out to that shoulder seam, and because there is going to be a seam in that shoulder, I'm going to extend it by a little bit. All right, so now if I were to flip this shirt down, you notice that I just have the shoulder, I don't have the neck, and I don't have the armhole. At this point, you really have to eyeball. Or if you have like a cork board underneath this sheeting, you could use pins and poke them through exactly where that neckband is, and the holes in the sheeting, you can just connect the dots, but you don't necessarily have to. So knowing that the neckband is about here, I'm actually going to place dots along where that neckband is up at the top. I know this neckband is about 3/4 inch wide, so bringing that in 3/4 inch to connect it to here, and I'm going to basically follow that curve. And that is my neck, the back of the neck. The armhole is a little bit more difficult because you have the sleeve here, and so what you can do is actually tuck the sleeve inside. And in fact, you can tuck it in, lay it flat, to get a general idea of where that seam is. Okay. So here I'm going to make a couple of dots, coming down vertically. The nice thing about this Sharpie is a thick Sharpie, the diameter of the tube holding the Sharpie is about 1/2 inch. So if you just put your Sharpie straight down so that the side of the pen is touching the fabric seam, you're going to get about a 1/2 inch seam allowance, seam allowance. Okay. Now that I've done those dots, I'm going to connect them. I'm going to go on a hair on the inside because, again, I'm using a serger, and so my seam allowance is a 1/4 inch, not a 1/2 inch like the thickness of the Sharpie. But to everyone else who is using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, you can pretty much use these dots as a guide. Nice and pretty. And for good measure, you can take your French seam and just check that everything is nice and well connected. We'll go this way. So we've got some nice seams here. Just gonna smooth them out and make sure that my curve is not poking through in any weird ways. There. Nice dark line. Okay. So you remove your pattern weights out of the way. move your shirt. This is the back of your t-shirt, included. And what you first want to do immediately is mark the fold. And then you want to label your pattern piece so that you know what this piece is. This is the back, and I'm going to give myself instructions here. I only need one, and I need to cut it on the fold. I have included a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And the last thing I want to do is make note of the direction of stretch. So, not all t-shirts are 4-way stretch, but every knit fabric has some degree of horizontal stretch, meaning stretching going side to side. So shirts, when you pull them over your head, you stretch them side to side to go over your shoulders, and down your body, right? So the stretch is always going to go from side to side, which means the grain of the fabric is going to go up and down vertical. The reason why this is important is when you go to make your cut of this pattern on fabric, you want it to be lined up so that the stretch is exactly going side to side and the grain is exactly going up and down. I loved Latch Mama, so this is not me knocking on them, but it's an observation that I've made sometimes with their boyfriend t-shirts. Simply because it's got these 2 layers, and it's kind of easy to see on here. Sometimes I have seen boyfriend shirts where this curve, instead of being nice and centered, it ends up kind of skewed onto one side. And that's because that piece of fabric for that front panel, or the front nursing axis or the back, was not cut on the stretch and grain. If it were cut on the stretch and grain, it should have been laid out straight like this and cut this way. But what happens when you get that kind of funky curve to the fabric, it means instead of being cut up straight like this, it was twisted in some way and cut on the bias. The bias is the diagonal aspect of the fabric, and this particular element is what gives it the most stretch. So this fabric is 4-way stretch. So I can stretch it side to side, and I can stretch it top to bottom, but if I grab the shoulder and the bottom hemline, it's far stretchier in this direction than either left and right, top and bottom. So when the shirt hangs, gravity tends to pull on that bias. So if it's not cut straight, that's what ends up happening. Hence, when you go to make your pattern piece, you want to make sure that you mark the stretch and the grain. And now we're going to move on to do the front 2 layers.